I've had examples where a model would detect like jet skis in historical images, but there were no jet skis in the image. It just has the notion of a jet ski, something that looks fairly similar to a jet ski, and then it starts applying the jet ski. Whereas every historian would say they were not invented back then, so it's impossible to do that. I see myself as what people call a digital historian, or sometimes called a computational historian, which means that I work with digitized archives. This could be textual sources, but also visual sources. And my goal is to see to what extent we can apply computational methods to these digitized sources. And in a way, this is different from thick descriptions, or what people sometimes call close reading, where you go to the archive and examine sources very closely, try to contextualize them. And what we do with computational method is also trying to describe these sources a bit more from a distance, trying to find patterns, trends in the data. But it's not as binary as you either do the close reading or you do the distant reading. I think you actually go back and forth between the two. So you still do the more qualitative analysis of the data to inform how you apply the digital methods, how you construct the models that you use to analyze these historical sources. So I think one clear distinction in the way how I work and how more traditional historians work is that in history, theory is often quite implicit. People have all kinds of ideas about the past, and they sort of form hypotheses in their head and they try to test it. If you want to use a computer to do things, you have to formalize what you're doing. You have to make it very explicit. What is it that I'm looking for in the sources? What are the assumptions that I have? What are the hypotheses that I have? And then you basically test these using the sources. The other thing I like to do is to start with a humanities or a historical question, but then think of, are there other fields outside of history that perhaps have certain theories or methods that I can apply to learn more about how people did what they do. So these could be theories from psychology, but it could also be theories more from the technical side. So how does information flow through a network of people? Historians are very interested in events. How did events take place? Can we figure out when they started, when they ended, what impact they had? And one thing that I wanted to test is there's a debate between, are the events these very concrete things that have a clear starting and end point, or are they more things that flow and flow into each other and are more ambiguous in that sense. So I wanted to see if I could use computational models to detect events, or actually people's response to events, but also the way these events impacted people's attention. So I used newspaper data, digitized newspaper data, front pages, and basically what I did is, the assumption was that if something happened in the world, newspapers start to write about it, and it sort of captures people's attention. People start to read about this every day in the newspaper, and the content in the newspaper becomes very similar in a sense. We write about it, the same story every single day, but once something has happened, we don't really talk about it anymore, and then attention goes to a different subject. That process I wanted to see if I could capture that using computational models. And it turns out we could detect events, also events that we don't really remember that well anymore, but we could also analyze how people's attention was drawn. And I think this is an example where you can study single events going to the archive, but taking a step back and using this computational intervention, it adds additional knowledge to events and also helps you to make sort of categories of events, and also compare how strong was the impact of a certain event set against all these other events. So how unique was it? Or was it just an event as all the others, in a sense. That is an example of going back and forth between this close and distant reading or qualitative and quantitative approach. One recent example is a study we did on the personnel records of the East India Company. We have kept a lot of the records detailing who was employed by the East India Company and then boarded a ship and went to the East. We also know that this is not a complete archive, that there must have been more people boarded the ships than is actually represented in the record. And what we did in this article, together with my colleague Volkert Kastorp, is that we applied models from ecology that are used to study species, for example birds, to estimate how many birds there are in a certain nature area, because you cannot observe all the birds. You see some of the birds, and then there are mathematical models that you can use to then estimate how many birds there actually are, or at least not actually are, but sort of a lower bound. It must be at least this many birds in this population. What we did is we transferred this method from ecology to history to estimate how many people we missed in these archives. We actually discovered that for some periods we missed a whole lot of people in the archives, making it almost impossible to use these archives to do quantitative analysis because you're using just a very small subset. For other periods we didn't miss that many people, so the archives were fairly complete, which gives you more confidence to then use these archives to draw conclusions about history. So this is a very small example or a very focused paper that helps us to estimate like what is in the archive and what is not in the archive, and can we use the archive to do quantitative analysis but also qualitative analysis. So the incompleteness of archives is a very complicated issue, I think, and an issue that humanities scholars have dealt with for a long time. Is this archive representative of what I'm trying to talk about? And there are many different reasons in which an archive can be incomplete, I think. Some people are not documented, or they are documented, but they are documented by certain people with a certain ideology. So the way they are documented is already biased in a sense. So think, for example, about oppressed people that are documented by the oppressor. There's a certain power dimension there and how they appear in the archives. And then there's also the lack of people not appearing in the archives. For a long time, historians were mostly examining males, more elite males. So a lot of archival information that is kept is also of the people that were deemed important. Nowadays, there's much more interest in different strata of society. So not just the white elites. But if you want to investigate that, you still need the sources, and these sources, sometimes historians go to all kinds of places to actually find them. But if you approach this from a more digital perspective, you not only need the sources, you also need them to be digitized. And then the question also arises from this power dimension. Digitization costs money. What are we going to digitize first? And luckily there are more and more initiatives that also talk about digitizing archives of not just the white male parts, more elite parts of societies, but also other parts of society. But again, and I don't want to overcomplicate this, there's a difficulty there. If, remember I talked about the archives of oppressed people, in a way, if a certain white institution decides to then digitize it, that is again a way of making records more available to a broader audience with information relating back to your heritage that you might not want to be made available or digitized, which is also a way of imposing power on an archive. And then there's the question, okay, let's say we have these digitized archives. How are we going to find people that might be in there, but they might be referred to in different ways than we refer to people now, or they are not referred to as human beings perhaps, or dehumanized. So we also need to have a very clear picture of how people were described in the past. Maybe people spoke of women, but only men talking about women, using particular ways to refer to women. So we have to think about how do we extract this information that might be there. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge if information is not there, it will be very difficult to get it out. Drawing back to my example of the East India Company, getting a sense of what is not in the archive is also very useful as a starting point. How biased is the archive towards certain groups of people, certain ideologies? And I think you can go to the archive and get a sense of the archive while reading it. And I think computational methods can also assist us in assessing this bias. Also because we have our own bias going to the archive. Imagine that if you go to the archive and you start reading and you're at the 1,000th document that you have read, your own perception has also changed, and then you're not going back to the first one again with what we have learned after reading 1,000 documents to go through it again to see if something has changed in how you approach it. In a way, using computation, that is a bit easier in a sense that you can detect bias perhaps, and then go over all the sources again, tweak it a little bit, go over all the sources again. And one other example could be if you go to an archive and say, this is my definition of X, of how males talk about it, and you have a way of finding the documents that take a completely different perspective. You can also use the models to find outliers, for example. And maybe there's not a lot of documents in the archive, but if you can use computational methods to find the ones that are different from the ones that are overrepresented, that can both save you a lot of time, but also, and that is even more important than just saving time, find the things that were very difficult to find previously. And one final example I can give is that we looked at bias relating to gender in textual data from the past. And we use large language models that we talk about a lot nowadays. We talk a lot about ChatGPT, which is also a large language model. And what we've done is looked at, is there a bias in which the way in which women are portrayed versus men in historical newspapers? Are job titles, so doctor, dentist, secretary, are they more closely linked to males or females? But also are certain emotions more clearly linked to males and females. And there we saw clear patterns of a gender bias in newspapers, but also that some newspapers showed a much clearer gender bias than others. So this is an example of a research you can also do on contemporary sources, but we added the time dimension, the historical dimension, to show that this also changed over time. And also changed differently across different sources. In my research, this primarily relates to large language models or AI models that are used for computer vision. Computer vision is the use of AI to try to understand what's going on in an image. And to train these models, huge amounts of data have been used that have mostly been crawled from the internet. So these could be data sets of images drawn from, for example, Flickr, the photo website, with all kinds of labels indicating what is on the image. The issue with these models is that they come from particular areas of the internet, mostly also areas of Western Europe or North America, so there's already a cultural bias in the data. But there's also a temporal bias that I find very interesting as a historian. This data was put on the internet. Well, the internet hasn't been around so long, and it's mostly data that has been put on the internet fairly recently, with us having all these smartphones, being able to easily make photos and upload them. So it's a very particular period of time that is captured in these image data sets. And the funny thing there is, if you look, for example, of images of cars, these are mostly contemporary cars. There are some old-fashioned cars in there, but mostly contemporary cars. Or images of even the internet. The way the internet looks, or websites look, changes quite fast. The notion of how a thing looks is not really historicized. It is a very atemporal way of looking at things. And I think as a historian, we are actually interested in how things might stay quite stable over time, the way they look, but also the way they change. And what I discovered is that if you start applying these models to historical data, so images from the past, they can struggle sometimes. So they might not recognize what is going on in the image. I've had examples where a model would detect like jet skis in historical images, but there were no jet skis in the image. But it just has the notion of a jet ski, something that looks fairly similar to a jet ski, and then it starts applying the jet ski. Whereas every historian would say they were not invented back then, so it's impossible to do this. So in a sense, this has to do with raising the historical awareness of these models. And one way to do this is adding more training data historical training data to these models, so that it becomes more sensitive to the different ways an object might have looked in the past. And this goes for image data, but it also goes for textual information, like language. Language also changes over time. And sometimes it can be quite fast. There are now words in popular culture that are used that weren't used 5 years ago. And people have shown in projects that if you start adding historical text to these large language models, you can actually change this bias that it has to contemporary material. Still, this notion of how time is encoded in these models is quite implicit. So to give an example, I'm now working on a project where we try to understand if we ask a model to date an image, to say this image is from the 1960s or even more precise, maybe 1965, what information in the image does an AI model use to determine the date? And of course, it's not only in the image, there's also contextual information. But an interesting example that we found is a photograph from the 1990s of an elderly couple in their house with all kinds of very old-fashioned furniture. And the model actually said, well, this is from the 1950s. And in a way it looked like the 1950s because all the furniture was from the 1950s. But the picture itself, if we look at the picture, we could see that it is a picture that is taken nowadays because of the quality of the image. You then use more the material aspects of the image to make this assumption. But it also shows that it's quite complicated, this task of historicizing images. And historians, of course, when they go to the archive, they not just look at one image and say this is from 1950. They look at other images, they look at sources found around the images, people talking about certain objects in the image. And this requires a more contextual knowledge of what is going on. And I think a lot of these models have a sense of context, but it's very implicit. And I think a lot of what is now being talked about as bias in models is also a lack of contextual information in these models. There's a famous example of images of weddings across the world, and when fed to an AI model, it can say for the traditional way how we in Europe view weddings, the gown and the guy in the suit. The model would say, oh, this is a wedding, it's very clear. It was already struggling with same-sex marriages because that is a more uncommon type and less data was fed to the model. But if images of weddings in other parts of the world where different clothes were being worn, sometimes quite colorful clothes, the model would say these are just two people. Of course, we could add images from other parts of the world with wedding to sort of compensate for this bias, but I think it would be more beneficial if there is an awareness of this is also a wedding. It's sort of the high level structure is wedding, but there's different ways in which weddings look across the world. And then as a historian, I would add not only culturally, geographically, but also in time. So for me, time is very much a contextual factor in these models as well. So I definitely think that these models impose a certain way of looking at the world. In an article I wrote a while ago, I approached them as sort of optical instruments in science and technology studies. People such as Bruno Latour have investigated how do we make knowledge. And he went to laboratories and looked at the equipment that people use and how the equipment also shapes how we do science. So even though we often think that the sciences is super objective, there is also a dimension there. If we have certain microscopes, we can do science in a certain way. The same goes, I think, for these AI systems. They also are instruments that have certain limitations, but also certain affordances that structure the way we construct knowledge and make knowledge. One thing that we often do when talking about these models is that we say they perform better than humans on this one task, but that's a very specific way of talking about the performance of humans, and it's also the way people achieve this, the way they measure this is often a very limited way of measuring things. So that is also an ideology that we impose on things, like how do we measure what human performance is? Is it being able to classify 1 million images in 5 minutes and not being 90% correct on these images? And then you can say, oh, human cannot do this in such a short time period, so the AI model is better. Or is what makes us human is also if you give a child 5 images of cats, different cats, it already has a concept of a cat, whereas an AI model needs maybe 10,000 images of cats before it can learn that it is a cat. AI systems such as ChatGPT, where we now often have this discussion of, is it aware of what it is doing? Is it actual language that it is doing, or is it just coming up with things? And I think it's not always very beneficial to approach it as a human, but I think that is also something instilled in our culture, that we do this in a certain way and we want to optimize the system according to certain things. Which brings me to another thing: what are we optimizing for these models? Is it them being very efficient, them doing things to save us work? Or could we also optimize them for other things? And that could be us being more creative, for instance. And I think there's different ways in which we use these models, but I think that depends on who is actually behind these models making them. I find the holy grail of big data quite fascinating, and it comes from this article by Chris Anderson, I think early 2000 in Wired, where he talks about if we have enough data, then the answers they come popping up, and we don't need any theories anymore. We just need to add data, and then magically things will appear. I think this is completely wrong. I think we need theories to investigate the data. We need models to apply to the data to test our hypothesis and see what we think about the world can be confirmed with the data or not. And I think we don't need to digitize everything to do this. One reason is there's constantly data being created. Not all historical material is still there, so we cannot even digitize it if we want to. And the other thing is, I think what people often talk about when they talk about digital humanities or digital history is that, oh, now we can do things in a large scale, and then we can ask all kinds of new questions and get all kinds of new answers. I think, yes, more data can help to add robustness to your analysis, so to show that something holds for more than just one source or one instance. But I think if it's just about scale, you see these large trends in data, things don't really change that much then over time. That's why they're large trends. There might be clear points in time where some things might change, but I think if you have a very clear way of entering the data, you will look at patterns not on the super high level, but also not on the micro scale, but somewhere in between. And I think that's where the interesting things happen. And for that, I think you don't need to constantly digitize, but you need to think of smart ways to structure your data, to sample your data. Social scientists have been thinking about this for a long time. How do I draw things from the data to say something with a certain certainty about what is there in the data, but also what this might say about the world outside of the data. And I think we need to spend more time thinking about how we should do this in the humanities. So working with the data that we have, also thinking about what is not there in the data, then putting all our efforts in digitizing data. I think it's still important to digitize the data, especially to get data on subjects that we don't have a lot of data on. But I think we should take a step back and think more about how do we get knowledge from the data, and not believe that magically knowledge will happen if we only digitize more and more data.